Ever wonder why commercial planes max out at around 590 miles per hour? Think about it, we literally build spaceships that can travel to Mars, yet the most advanced passenger jets from Boeing and Airbus have been locked into this exact speed limit for over half a century. You might think it is just because the engines are not powerful enough, but the real answer is far more shocking. At 950 kilometers per hour, the peaceful air outside turns into a brutal, invisible enemy. We are talking about forces that can literally tear a jet apart, freeze cockpit controls, or even stretch a metal fuselage by a whole foot right in midair. So, what are these invisible walls holding us back? Let's find out right now, right here, on Simple but Surprising. The first reason comes down to a deadly physical limit that aviation history learned the hard way back in the 1950s. To fly faster and save fuel, planes must fly incredibly high, where the air is thin and drag is low. But at that altitude, humans can't breathe. Engineers have to pump air inside, essentially turning the cabin into a pressure cooker. The plane acts like a balloon, expanding on the way up and shrinking on the way down. This is where disaster struck the de Havilland Comet, the world's very first commercial jet. In 1954, a comet suddenly disintegrated in midair. To find out why, engineers submerged a whole fuselage in a giant water tank to repeatedly pump and drain pressure. What they found shocked them. The deadly tears started right at the sharp, 90-degree corners of the square windows. These sharp corners acted like stress magnets. After repeated flights, the pressure focused on those exact spots until the metal fatigued and snapped like an overstretched rubber band. The plane literally tore itself apart in midair just because of square corners. So before engineers could even chase more speed, they first had to solve a more basic problem: how to keep a pressurized tube alive through thousands of climbs and descents. The Comet disaster taught a brutal lesson. If you want to fly high to get those high speeds, your plane must survive the pressure wall. That is why every airplane window today is rounded. But once planes finally reached that perfect high altitude to push for speed, pilots ran directly into a much deeper aerodynamic trap. Think of a plane at this altitude like someone walking on a razor-thin tightrope stretched over a giant abyss. One misstep to the left, and you slip and free fall. One misstep to the right, and the rope snaps. The higher the plane flies, the narrower that tightrope becomes. Pilots call this terrifying danger zone the coffin corner. The logic is simple. The higher you go, the thinner the air gets. To keep a heavy jet from falling like a stone, the pilot has to fly incredibly fast just to generate lift. But here's the catch. If they push too fast, and parts of the airflow over the wing can go transonic, creating shockwaves, buffet, drag, and control problems the aircraft was not meant to sit in. This leaves the pilot completely trapped. Fly a little too slow, you drop. Fly a little too fast, you also drop. At extreme altitudes, the safe margin between these two disasters squeezes down to just a few miles per hour. There is absolutely zero room for error. If you drift off this tightrope, things go downhill instantly. And this invisible trap is exactly what sealed the fate of Air France Flight 447 in 2009. In 2009, an Airbus A330 carrying 228 people was cruising through a pitch-black storm over the Atlantic Ocean when suddenly, beep beep, the autopilot cut out. The culprit was a tiny detail most passengers never think about: the exterior speed sensors, called pitot tubes, that help measure how fast the aircraft is moving through the air. When they iced over, the speed readings became unreliable. And at 35,000 feet, losing reliable speed information is not a small problem. The aircraft was not doomed in that first moment. It was still intact. It was still recoverable. But high-altitude flying gives pilots much less room to guess wrong. Now the crew had to fly manually, at night, over the ocean, in bad weather, without clear speed information. Trapped in darkness and weather, the crew lost situational awareness. Instead of simply holding the aircraft steady and letting the situation stabilize, the nose was pulled up. That one input changed everything. The jet climbed briefly, lost airspeed, and entered an aerodynamic stall. At that altitude, forcing the nose up can quickly drain the speed the wings need to keep producing lift. And here is the terrifying part. The plane did not explode. It did not break apart. The engines were still running. The wings were still attached. The cockpit was still working. But aerodynamically, it was no longer flying the way the crew thought it was. The wings were no longer producing enough lift to recover unless the nose came down. Instead, the aircraft kept ascending in a deep stall, falling toward the Atlantic for several minutes while the crew struggled to understand what the plane was really doing. All 228 people on board were lost. That is why speed margins matter so much at altitude. A passenger jet is not just fighting gravity, it is trying to stay inside a narrow, invisible window, fast enough to keep flying, but not so fast that shockwaves, drag, and control problems start taking over. So, if speed is the main issue, why do we not just build planes with razor-thin, knife-sharp wings to easily slice through the air past 950 kilometers per hour? Sounds logical, but engineers run into a massive catch-22 here. While a paper-thin wing works beautifully at high speeds, it's a total disaster during takeoff and landing. Why? Because at slower speeds, it simply can't generate enough lift to keep a massive airliner in the air. Beyond that, a thin wing leaves you with almost no internal room, and that matters more than most passengers realize. The wings are not just wings, they are also the aircraft's main fuel tanks, holding thousands of gallons of fuel. A razor-thin wing means less room for fuel, less room for mechanical actuators and hydraulics, and less structural depth where the wing connects to the body. Most importantly, the wing root needs thickness to handle the immense bending stress during flight. If the wing were thin as a knife, it would be much harder to make it strong enough for a heavy passenger jet. To survive in both worlds, modern airliners use swept wings, angled backward to delay drag and shockwave problems as they approach transonic speeds. In practice, most commercial airliners settle into a narrow sweet spot, usually somewhere around 900 to 1,000 kilometers per hour, or about 560 to 620 miles per hour. That is fast enough to make long-distance flying efficient, but not so fast that drag, buffet, fuel burn, and structural stress start taking over. But those physical limits on wing design and that violent shaking are actually only half the problem. Even if engineers could build a perfect wing that can take the beating, what really killed our dream of flying faster is something much more realistic: pure cash. It turns out that a thirst for raw speed can bankrupt a major airline in a matter of months. As a plane gets closer to Mach 1, it hits a phenomenon called drag rise. The air physics change completely, creating a massive invisible wall of resistance that fights the plane. To push through this drag, the engines have to work overtime, and fuel burn skyrockets at an insane, exponential rate. The operating costs blow up so fast that ticket prices become completely unaffordable for normal people. This exact financial reality is what forced Boeing engineers in December 2002 to completely shut down the Boeing Sonic Cruiser. This was a revolutionary project with a canard delta wing designed to dominate the skies at Mach 0.98. But when the math did not make financial sense, they killed the project, marking the end of their near supersonic dream. In the end, it is the passenger's wallet, not the engine, that dictates how fast we fly. Forget about money for a second. Even with a mountain of cash to burn, aviation still slams directly into a brutal wall of physics, the thermal barrier. Would you believe that a commercial airliner could actually grow a full foot longer right in the middle of a flight? This is 100% true for the legendary Concorde. Flying at over 2,000 kilometers per hour, faster than a speeding bullet, the jet did not just slice through the sky. It brutally compressed the air so violently that it baked the plane's nose to a blistering 260 degrees Fahrenheit. This intense heat caused the metal skin to expand, stretching the entire aircraft by up to 30 centimeters during cruise. This stretching created a fascinating phenomenon inside the cockpit. As the fuselage lengthened, it pushed the rear wall backward, opening up a noticeable gap right next to the flight engineer's panel, wide enough to fit a human fist. Concorde crews turned this into a legendary retirement ritual. On the aircraft's final supersonic flight, the flight engineer would slip his uniform cap into the widened gap. As the jet landed, cooled down, and contracted back to its normal size, the airframe locked down like a vise, permanently trapping the hat as a hidden time capsule. If you tried to force a standard aluminum, Boeing or Airbus to those speeds, the heat would sap the metal's strength, warping the fuselage like a plastic bottle dropped into boiling water. That is why Concorde had to be built from a specialized heat-tolerant aluminum alloy. Managing this thermal wall was so meticulously expensive that no airline could afford it. But even if you build a perfect, heat-resistant supersonic jet, you still can't escape one final enemy, the sonic boom. This extreme speed triggers an acoustic nightmare on the ground, forcing us to choose between raw speed and a peaceful life. In 1964, the US military tested this by blasting F-104 fighters supersonically over Oklahoma City. It was absolute chaos. Windows shattered, dishes rattled off shelves, and panicked, residents ran outside thinking bombs were dropping. The public backlash was so severe that the FAA banned all commercial supersonic flights over land in 1973, a restriction that later crippled the legendary Concorde. This deafening blast has nothing to do with engine noise, it's pure air displacement. When a plane goes supersonic, it pushes air molecules away faster than they can naturally escape. The air bunches up into violent shockwaves off the nose and wings, dragging a continuous boom carpet along the ground. In fact, even a completely silent, engineless glider would trigger a loud sonic boom at this speed. This noise restriction turned transcontinental supersonic flight into a financial dead end. Think about it. A multi-million-dollar speed machine is completely useless if it is legally forced to slam on the brakes and cruise at standard, boring speeds the second it reaches a coastline. However, NASA is fighting back with its experimental X-59 program. By meticulously reshaping the aircraft's body, engineers can prevent shockwaves from merging into a loud boom. The goal is to turn that thunderous blast into a gentle sonic thump, protecting peace on the ground while finally restoring the dream of ultra-fast travel. But those strict limits do not mean aviation has given up on speed. If anything, they have started a new race. Not just to build a faster airplane, but to build one people on the ground can actually live with. NASA and Lockheed Martin are testing one path with the X-59, a research aircraft shaped to reduce the sharp sonic boom into something closer to a softer sonic thump. The goal is not just to build a fast airplane. The goal is to prove whether supersonic flight over land could one day be quiet enough for regulators and communities to accept. On the commercial side, Boom Supersonic is chasing a different path. Its XP-1 demonstrator broke the sound barrier in 2025, and the company wants to scale those lessons into Overture, a passenger jet aimed at flying faster than today's airliners. But turning a successful test aircraft into everyday airline service is a much harder promise. A future supersonic jet cannot just be fast. It has to be economical enough for airlines, certifiable enough for regulators, quiet enough for people on the ground, and clean enough to survive modern climate scrutiny. Boom has talked about using sustainable aviation fuel, but that does not magically erase every environmental question. SAF still has challenges around cost, supply, production, and real-world emissions. So the question is not just whether a supersonic aircraft can fly, the question is whether it can fly often, affordably, and responsibly. There is also the sonic boom problem. Some companies are exploring ways to manage altitude, speed, wind, and temperature so the shockwaves bend or weaken before reaching the ground. But that is not a magic switch. It depends on atmospheric conditions, flight profile, and whether regulators are willing to trust the results. So yes, the dream is still alive. New York to London in just a few hours, faster business trips, shorter ocean crossings, and a sky that feels a little more futuristic again. But this new era will not win just by being fast. It has to hit a very difficult jackpot. Faster than today's jets, quieter than Concorde, cleaner than old supersonic aircraft, and affordable enough that airlines can actually sell the seats. In the end, aviation's speed limit is not a failure of imagination. It is a compromise between physics, money, noise, fuel, and the simple fact that people on the ground do not want the future rattling their windows every afternoon. So what would you choose? Pay more to cross the Atlantic in just a few hours, or keep the slower flight and spend the savings when you land? Tell me in the comments, because this is one of those questions where the better answer really depends on who's paying. And if this made flying feel a little less ordinary, subscribe for more simple things that turn out to be surprisingly complicated. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.